Grandpa Pete's here again, the young firefighter said mockingly, watching the 72-year-old volunteer gear up for another call. What's he going to do at his age? His buddy laughed. Hold a hose and get in the way? Pete Anderson said nothing, just quietly checked his equipment like he had for 18 years. What they didn't know was that those same hands had spent 30 years handling the world's most dangerous chemical weapons in places where one mistake meant death for thousands. And today, when a chemical plant explosion turned their small Pennsylvania town into a potential disaster zone, those young firefighters were about to learn why some knowledge can only be earned through hell itself. Welcome to Echo Stories. Before we begin this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Millfield, Pennsylvania, population 8,500, nestled in the Allegheny Mountains about 40 miles east of Pittsburgh. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the volunteer fire department was staffed by locals who'd grown up together, and where the biggest excitement was usually a barn fire or a car accident on Route 22. Pete Anderson had been volunteering with the Millfield VFD for 18 years, ever since he'd moved to town after his wife passed. At 72, he was by far the oldest active volunteer, but he showed up every Saturday for training and responded to every call, day or night. The younger guys, most in their 20s and 30s, tolerated him more than welcomed him. To them, Pete was just another old-timer trying to relive his glory days. He drove slow, talked little, and never shared war stories like some vets did. His application had listed Army Chemical Corps, 1970 to 2000, but nobody had bothered to ask what that meant. Pete preferred it that way. He'd seen enough action for several lifetimes, and retirement in a quiet mountain town suited him fine. The volunteer work kept him busy and gave him purpose without the life-or-death stakes he'd left behind. On this particular Tuesday morning, Pete was at the station doing equipment checks when the first alarm came in. Structure fire, Patterson Chemical Industries, 1247 Industrial Drive. Multiple explosions reported. All units respond immediately. The station erupted in controlled chaos. 8 volunteers scrambled for their gear while Chief Morrison coordinated with dispatch. Pete moved with his usual deliberate pace, checking his equipment methodically while the younger guys rushed around him. "Come on, Grandpa Pete," shouted Danny Walsh, a 28-year-old electrician who fancied himself the station's resident comedian. "We don't have all day." "Yeah, save some hero work for the rest of us," added Mike Torino, pulling on his turnout coat. Pete said nothing, just finished his equipment check and climbed into Engine 3. As they rolled out, he could see the black smoke rising from the industrial park, thick, acrid clouds that made his trained eye narrow with concern. Patterson Chemical had been in Millfield for 30 years, manufacturing industrial solvents and cleaning compounds. Pete had driven past it countless times, noting the hazmat placards and wondering what they were really cooking up in there. Now, he was about to find out. The scene that greeted them was chaos. Patterson Chemical's main building was fully engulfed, with secondary explosions sending debris flying every few minutes. Employees were evacuating in panic, some showing signs of chemical exposure, burning eyes, difficulty breathing, skin irritation. Chief Morrison tried to establish a perimeter, but confusion reigned. "What are we dealing with here?" he radioed to the first arriving police unit. "Unknown chemicals, Chief. Plant manager says they manufacture industrial solvents, but he's not sure what specific compounds were involved in the explosion." That's when Pete stepped forward. While the other volunteers were still getting oriented, he was already reading the smoke patterns, wind direction, and the color of the flames. His trained nose picked up the distinct odors mixing in the air. "Chief," Pete said quietly, appearing at Morrison's shoulder. "Not now, Pete. We've got a situation here." "That's exactly why you need to listen. I can tell you what we're dealing with." Morrison turned, surprised by the authority in the old man's voice. "What are you talking about?" Pete pointed to the flames. "See how the fire burns blue-green at the base? That's copper compounds, probably copper sulfate solutions. The white smoke mixing with the black indicates chlorinated solvents, likely trichloroethylene or perchloroethylene. And that sweet smell underneath? That's benzene compounds." The chief stared at him. "How do you know all that?" Because I spent 30 years in Army Chemical Corps, and those compounds will kill everyone in a half-mile radius if we don't handle this right. Chief Morrison's radio crackled. Chief, we've got people collapsing downwind of the fire. EMS is requesting immediate evacuation of the area. Pete had already anticipated this. Chief, we need to establish a hot zone at least 300 yards upwind. Nobody without level A hazmat suits gets closer, and we need to contact the county hazmat team immediately. Pete, I appreciate your input, but Chief, Pete's voice carried a tone that cut through the noise. In 1987, I was part of the team that responded to a chemical depot fire in Germany. Similar compounds. We lost 4 firefighters because they didn't understand what they were dealing with. You want to lose your men today? Morrison looked around at his volunteers, Danny, Mike, and the others, all young men with families, all looking to him for direction. Then he looked back at Pete, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. What do you need? Pete's transformation was immediate and complete. The shuffling old man disappeared, replaced by someone who moved with purpose and spoke with absolute authority. First, pull everyone back 200 yards. Those compounds create a thermal plume that carries toxins much farther than normal fires. Second, approach from upwind only. Third, no water on the chemical storage areas. Water will spread the contamination and could cause more explosions. Then how do we fight it? We don't fight it directly. We contain it and let it burn out while protecting exposures. The EPA will want soil samples from a quarter-mile radius, and everyone who's been exposed needs immediate decontamination. Chief Morrison got on the radio. All units establish perimeter 200 yards back. Approach from north side only. County hazmat. What's your ETA? 20 minutes out, Chief. Pete shook his head. Not fast enough. Danny, Mike, I need you to set up a decontamination station using Engine 2's water supply. Strip wash for anyone who's been within 100 yards of the fire. The 2 young firefighters who'd been mocking him an hour earlier now looked at him with something approaching awe. Yes, sir, Danny said without thinking, then caught himself. Yes, Pete. As Pete coordinated the response, his background became impossible to ignore. He spoke in technical terms about vapor pressures and toxic exposure limits. He identified chemical compounds by smell and flame color. He predicted wind shifts and contamination patterns with uncanny accuracy. Pete, Chief Morrison asked during a brief lull, what exactly did you do in the Army? Chemical warfare defense. Started in Vietnam detecting Agent Orange contamination, ended up running CBRN response teams in the Gulf War. 30 years of dealing with things that can kill you in parts per million. Mike Torino approached, his earlier smugness replaced by curiosity. CBRN? Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear. When bad things leak, spill, or explode, someone has to figure out how to clean it up without killing everyone in the process. The county hazmat team arrived and Pete seamlessly integrated with their operations. The team leader, a veteran named Rodriguez, recognized him immediately. Pete Anderson. Jesus, what are you doing here? I live here now. Volunteer firefighter. Rodriguez laughed. Volunteer? Chief, you know you've got one of the top chemical warfare experts on the East Coast running with your department? As the immediate crisis was contained, Pete found himself the center of attention for the first time in years. The young volunteers who dismissed him that morning were now hanging on his every word. So you were like, military special forces? Danny asked. Chemical Corps isn't special forces. We're the people who get called when special forces encounter something that could kill them without them knowing it. Like what? Pete considered his words carefully. Ever hear of chemical weapons disposal? Someone has to take apart nerve gas stockpiles in weapons-grade anthrax. Someone has to clean up when laboratories have accidents with things that don't have antidotes. Mike was incredulous. And you just retired to Millfield? My wife wanted to live somewhere quiet. After she passed, I stayed. Figured I'd done enough dangerous work for one lifetime. Chief Morrison approached with a grim expression. Pete, county's saying the contamination is worse than they initially thought. They want to evacuate a 2-mile radius. Pete nodded. I figured as much when I saw the secondary storage building catch fire. That's where they kept the really nasty stuff. industrial acids, heavy metal compounds. We're looking at a Superfund cleanup site now. What followed was a textbook example of hazmat response, orchestrated by a man who'd written parts of the actual textbook. Pete coordinated with EPA representatives, advised on evacuation procedures, and helped establish long-term monitoring protocols. The younger firefighters found themselves learning more about chemical safety in one day than they'd learned in years of training. Pete's quiet authority and deep knowledge commanded respect from everyone on scene, from federal agents to local officials. "Why didn't you ever tell us about your background?" Chief Morrison asked as they watched the controlled burn from a safe distance. "Because it doesn't matter who I was. What matters is who I am now, a volunteer firefighter in Millfield, Pennsylvania. But your expertise is available when needed. Most days we're dealing with car accidents and kitchen fires. This kind of thing is rare, and I hoped it would stay that way." News of the chemical plant fire made national headlines, largely because of the expert response that prevented a major environmental disaster. When reporters tried to interview Pete, he directed them to Chief Morrison and the county hazmat team, but word got out anyway. The Millfield Gazette ran a story. "Local volunteer firefighters' military background saves town." The story mentioned Pete's decorated career and his role in preventing what could have been a catastrophic toxic release. The response from the community was immediate and overwhelming. People Pete had known for years suddenly saw him differently. The mailman thanked him personally. The grocery store clerk refused to let him pay for coffee. Parents approached him at the hardware store to express their gratitude. Pete was uncomfortable with the attention, but he noticed a change in his fellow firefighters. Danny and Mike no longer made jokes about his age or pace. During training sessions, they asked genuine questions about hazmat response and chemical safety. "You know," Danny said one Saturday morning, "we never really thought about what else you might know." "Most people don't," Pete replied, "and that's usually fine. But when bad things happen, sometimes old knowledge comes in handy." As the weeks passed, Pete found himself becoming an informal mentor to the younger volunteers. Not about heroics or war stories, but about preparation, knowledge, and responsibility. "The thing about dangerous work," he told them during a training session, "is that most of it is boring. You study, you prepare, you maintain equipment, you drill procedures. When the real emergency happens, you don't have time to figure things out." Mike had been researching Pete's background online. "I found some articles about chemical weapons destruction in the Middle East. Were you really involved in destroying Saddam's stockpiles?" "That's classified, and it's not important. What's important is that you understand why we check our equipment before every call, why we study material safety data sheets, why we practice decontamination procedures." The conversation was interrupted by an alarm. "Structure fire, 1247 Elm Street, possible entrapment." As they geared up, Pete noticed the difference in the team's demeanor. They moved with more purpose, checked their equipment more carefully, and looked to him not as a burden, but as a resource. The fire at Elm Street turned out to be routine, a kitchen fire that had spread to the living room with no hazmat complications. But Pete's role in the response was different now. He was part of the team in a way he hadn't been before, his knowledge respected and his experience valued. After the call, Chief Morrison pulled him aside. "Pete, the county is asking if you'd be willing to help train other volunteer departments in hazmat response." "I'm retired, Chief." "I know, but what happened at Patterson Chemical, that could happen anywhere. These small departments don't have your background." Pete considered this. "Maybe a few training sessions, basic chemical safety, recognition of hazardous materials, when to call for help." "That would be tremendous. And Pete, thank you for being here, for knowing what to do, for keeping us all safe." Pete nodded. "That's what we do, Chief. We keep each other safe." 6 months later, Pete was still volunteering with the Millfield VFD, still showing up every Saturday for training, still responding to calls. But now the younger volunteers competed to ride with him, knowing they'd learned something valuable. The Patterson chemical site had been cleaned up and declared safe, thanks largely to the proper initial response that prevented widespread contamination. Pete had testified before EPA investigators, provided technical expertise to cleanup crews, and helped establish new safety protocols for the industrial park. But most days, he was just Pete Anderson, volunteer firefighter, checking equipment and preparing for the next call. The difference was that now his fellow firefighters understood the depth of knowledge and experience he brought to their small-town department. "You know what I learned?" Danny told Mike during one training session. "It's not about being a hero. It's about being prepared for when people need you to know what you're doing." Pete overheard and smiled. That might have been the most important lesson of all. And so, in a small Pennsylvania town, it was proven once again that expertise and experience often hide in plain sight. A man dismissed as too old to contribute had knowledge that saved thousands of lives and prevented an environmental catastrophe. Real heroes don't announce themselves. They show up, do the work, and share their knowledge when it matters most. Sometimes the person you least expect has exactly the skills you need. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe stories like this should continue to be told, support Echo Stories by subscribing. See you in the next video. And remember, that quiet volunteer at your local fire department might have more experience than you can imagine. Everyone has a story, and that story deserves respect.